So next, let's turn our attention to education and civil liberties more specifically. So given that the focus has been on rationality and autonomy or human freedom, freedom of expression, well, that suggests that we have a new sort of approach to education and civil liberties, right? Education, we can think of that as a civil liberty. It is a liberty. It is a sort of right that we have as individuals in a society. And this civil liberty, this right to education, is going to apply to everyone equally, no matter who you are, what your culture is, what your race is, what your sex is, what your religion is, no matter your geographical location. None of that matters. Everybody has the same right to be educated insofar as you have a certain capacity for rationality. And this, again, is grounded in the greatest happiness principle, the principle that says that we need to maximize the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, that that's the morally right thing to do. So when we restrict education from certain individuals, then in doing so, we're doing something morally wrong, right? Because we're failing to maximize the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. We're restricting the ability to cultivate one's education, one's reason and rationality. We're restricting their ability to freely express their autonomous choice through education. And that, according to utilitarians, simply is morally wrong because it promotes suffering and it does not maximize happiness. Therefore, philosophers like Bentham and Mill thought that education is absolutely crucial, fundamental to having an open and democratic society. Indeed, the right to education, education as a civil liberty, is fundamental to understanding the rest of the civil liberties. As Bentham argued back in 1789, he argued for a whole plethora of different civil liberties that had never even really been thought of before. And it's hard to really recognize just how radical this was for this time, because a lot of these liberties we now recognize as just being obvious. We recognize them today in 2022 as being the sort of liberties that everybody should just obviously have. But back in 1789, when this was written, it was not at all obvious. In fact, the obvious thing was just the opposite. So this was really a radical approach. So let's look at then some of the civil liberties that Bentham and then later Mill argued in support of. So first, they argued in support of economic liberties or liberalism in general. This is having a kind of access to economic equality, no matter who you are, no matter what your culture or creed or geographical location or nationality. None of these things mattered insofar as you had a right to economic freedom. And again, that's because it maximizes the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. And you can't get economic freedom without education. And insofar as education is absolutely crucial and fundamental, then we can see then that freedom of expression, freedom of thought itself is a crucial and fundamental civil liberty, right? So this is just, it goes hand in hand with education, that we would need a certain amount of freedom of expression, a freedom to think whatever it is that we want to think, having new thoughts, new ideas, rather than just merely thinking whatever we're told we must think. So this kind of freedom of expression safeguards against a certain amount of dogmatism that was arguably just rampant at this point in human history. Likewise, we have a separation of church and state. Again, this was something that just simply wasn't even thought of at that time. But we can see how it was not only radical for them, but it led to a radical new way of thinking about government and the New World in the United States with the Constitution. Embedded in the Constitution, we have the separation of church and state. And this wasn't to get rid of the church, but rather this was to protect certain religious ideas, certain religious doctrine. So you weren't forced to believe or to practice any particular religious view. Again, this is tied right back down to freedom of expression, freedom of thought, autonomy, and education, right? So that also It goes hand in hand with separation of church and state, where the government did not obligate you to practice or believe any particular church dogmas or doctrines. We also saw a radical new sort of civil liberties regarding women's rights, the sort of birth of women's suffrage, if you will. And again, this gets right back to maximizing the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people or sentient creatures, right? So it wasn't just men or men that owned property that were a part of the moral community and could be morally harmed. Women were included too, because women can experience suffering and pain. And so women have certain rights and liberties just like men or property owners. This was a radical departure from even the views of Locke, who we've just talked about a couple modules ago. And insofar as animals are sentient, the utilitarians argued that animals have rights as well. Animals can experience pain and pleasure, and so animals can be harmed. Animals, we can do harm to animals, at least certain animals, non-human animals that have a certain amount of sentience. And included in the sort of civil liberties that utilitarians argued for was a very specific argument against slavery. It was an argument for the abolition of slavery, which, as we've been discussing in previous modules, people said different things about slavery, and sometimes it's not immediately obvious how we should interpret what they have to say. But in this case, it is very clear how we should interpret the utilitarians' approach to slavery. It was just straightforwardly immoral because it restricted people's autonomy, right? It restricted their ability to have a certain amount of happiness and pleasure. Indeed, it promoted suffering and pain. And insofar as it did that, it was immoral. And it should not be included in the way in which we understand political theory or how we should construct a just society. Likewise, they argue for the abolition of things like capital punishment or corporal punishment. These were simply unheard of at the time, even though we may think of those as being more contemporary civil liberties, at least in some places. At that point in time, it was unheard of. Likewise, prison reform was one of the things they argued for as well. Again, this gets right back to maximizing the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people, regardless of whether you're a prisoner or not. So merely having committed some crime and being put in jail doesn't mean that you can't experience pain and suffering, doesn't mean that you can't be happy or experience some amount of pleasure, even though your autonomy may be restricted. Nonetheless, you can still be harmed. You're still a part of the moral community. And finally, one of the issues that has changed in contemporary society in the last 10 years is gay marriage and sort of society's perspective on being gay in general. For the utilitarians, they specifically argued for the decriminalization of homosexual acts or being gay, right? So again, this is just another example of how radical a departure this was from the prevailing views of both morals and politics during the 18th and 19th century. And I think that this is really interesting, especially as it relates to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s syllabus. Notice that the syllabus ends on a discussion of utilitarians. And I think that we need to keep in mind just how radical both utilitarians were as it relates to the political theories that preceded it, and just how radical Dr. King's approach was regarding the political doctrines of his time, a mere 50 years ago. Now, having said all of that, I want to conclude this video by returning to this question about the relationship between morality and politics, or more specifically, a question of the freedom of thought as relates to the political life. Recall the question we began with in the very beginning of this course, back in module 1, and when we discussed Plato's Apology, we had this question: is the philosophical life compatible with the political life? Remember that Socrates was put to death for kind of advocating for the philosophical life, or if you think about the way it was described, for for corrupting the youth with philosophy, right? And so that kind of led to this question of, well, how can we do both politics and philosophy if that means that you're going to get murdered or killed or at least ostracized in some sense for engaging in the philosophical life? Maybe it would be better just to engage in the political life and be politically active without being philosophical in any regards. Well, so for the utilitarians, folks like Bentham and Mill, the answer to the question is yes. Yes, the philosophical life is compatible with the political life. So why? Why did they think that the answer was yes? The philosophical life for utilitarians is necessary for the political life. The reason why it's necessary, why we must have a philosophical life in order to have a political life, is because genuine political engagement requires debate, requires open exchange of ideas and perspectives, different political perspectives from different cultures, different religions, different upbringings, different geographical locations. We need to be able to have an open exchange of these ideas, an open exchange of thought and freedom of expressing your views. That's required in order to maximize the most happiness and minimize suffering and pain. And it's only with the open discussion of one's ideas, a defense of their views, it's only then that we can have legitimate or genuine political activity, political life. So then, instead of politics excluding alternative ideas or perspectives, whatever those might be, whatever might be contrary to the dominant prevailing doctrines and ideas at the time, well, instead of excluding them, politics must encourage them. They must engage in open and public discourse and debate. You must have a defense of your beliefs, not merely having some opinion, right? You don't blindly follow whatever the preacher says from the podium. You ask questions. You offer alternative views. You offer different defenses of one view versus another view, and you try to figure out what is the best approach, right? Given one's a defense of their political ideas or political ideology, which one makes most sense to you? Which one leads to a better society? Which one is going to bring about more happiness and a better world in general? Therefore, we can think of morality and politics as being intimately intertwined. Morality and politics are brought together. They're unified, they're made consistent because politics requires an open expression of thought, of ideas, of debate, discourse about what is the best way of doing things. What is justice? What is the just city, and so forth? It's then with the open exchange of different ideas about morality, justice, the just city, and so forth. It's at that point that we are able to bring together morality and politics. And insofar as we bring together morality and politics, then we're bringing together the philosophical life and the political life. And so I think that's a nice way to kind of conclude what we've discussed in this course. That's definitely going to be the conclusion of this video lecture. What I want you to do now is to watch the following videos as it relates to the political philosophy, the political ideals of Martin Luther King Jr. after the I Have a Dream speech. Right, so some of the speeches that he gave at the end of his life. So that's what you will do in the remaining part of this module and for this course.